Now let's take a look at particle systems. 3ds Max has a number of different ways to create particle systems. It has a standard generic particle system. It also has something called particle flow, which is a little more sophisticated. And it also has MASH, which is another really great particle system. Now, we don't have time to get into all of those, but I am going to show you how to create a very simple particle system so you understand the process. Now, we can create a particle system under our standard create menu. If I go over here to geometry and pull down my tab here, you'll see I have particle systems. And so we can create any number of different types of particle systems here. We can also go into create here. And again, we have particles. So we have all of these different particle systems, and these pretty much match what we have in here. So I'm going to actually create a pretty standard spray type of particle system. So we have two here. We have spray and super spray. Now I'm going to go ahead and select super spray, and you can see we have all of these basic parameters. But I'm just going to go into my top viewport and just left click and drag, and that brings out the icon for that. Now I'm going to go into my perspective window, and let's go ahead and just hit playback. And you can see that it emits a stream of particles. Now we can modify this in the Modify panel. So I'm going to go into Modify, make sure I have that super spray selected. Now we have a number of parameters for this. In fact, I'm going to expand this so we can kind of see all of the different parameters that we have. One is basically how are the particles formed. So right now they're coming out in a straight line. So if I scrub my timeline, you can see that everything's coming out as a straight line. But if I want to, I can bring that off axis, in other words, angle the stream. And then I can create a spread for the stream. So instead of a straight line, it's coming out at more of an angle. Now I can also take it off plane and spread it as well. Now, we also have viewport display, and we'll get to that in just a little bit, but this is really just how many particles are showing. And by default, it's only showing 10% of the particles. So if I type that up to 100%, you would see that I'm getting a much thicker stream of particles. Now, the next tab here is particle quantity. How many particles are we generating per frame? So in this case, we're generating 10 particles per frame, but I can expand that or bring it down. So if I wanted to, I could do 1 particle per frame, and as you see, it kind of goes less, or I can go more. I'm going to keep this at 10. Now we also have the speed of the particles, so I can make my particles go faster or slower. So let's go ahead and pump this up to 20. And then we can also have a variation in speed, which is nice. Now the next one is pretty important, which is the timing of the particles. So right now, we have our particles start at frame 0, and they're going to stop emitting at frame 30. So after frame 30, there are no more particles. If we want this to be continuous, we're going to have to bring this number up. So I have 100 frames of my animation, so I'm going to go ahead and just put that up to 100. And then we also have display until. So if we go past 100, these particles will stop displaying. So you have to be careful with this if you're using this particular particle generation. But as you can see, we have particles now throughout the whole scene. Now we can also change the size of the particles. Now these particle sizes won't be seen if we're doing ticks. Now, in the viewport display, we can display the actual mesh of the particles or ticks. So if I change this to mesh, it's going to actually show the actual particles that are being generated. So if I increase the size, you can see how that increases the size of those objects. So now I've got bigger particles. And then finally, the type of particle. So right now, we're using what are called standard particles. And those standard particles can be triangles, which is what we have here. We can also change them to cubes, spheres, what are called facing particles, which is basically just a square that is always facing the viewer. And that's really great for a lot of visual effects. Also do 6 points, which are kind of like stars and so on. So if I were to keep this, say, at spheres, you can see that we now are emitting a pile of spheres. Now, in addition to the particle types, we can also do what's called metaparticles, and these are particles that kind of blob together. So this is kind of good for doing stuff such as water and those sorts of effects. And then we can also instance geometry. So if I want the particle to look like a very specific object, I can model that object and then instance it into a particle system. And all of those controls for metaparticles and instancing are here. And then finally, we have stuff like material mapping. And then we can also do stuff like rotation and collision, inherited motion, and things such as particle spawn. So if a particle hits another object, is it going to spawn another object? So I'm going to keep this pretty simple. So let's just keep this where we have it right here. Now we can also affect the particle system with forces. Now a force is basically just a space warp. So if we want, we can add a space warp, which would add a force such as gravity. So we can go back into our Create panel, go over to space warps, and then under forces, you'll see we have a number of these. We have wind, gravity, and so on. I'm going to actually select gravity, left click in the viewport, and drag, and I want that arrow pointing down. Now once I have that in the viewport, I need to, again, bind the particle system to the space warp. So if I have a space warp in the scene, it's not going to be active on any objects unless they are bound. So I'm going to go ahead and select Bind to Space Warp, hover over the particle system, left click and drag that line over to gravity. When I do that, watch what happens. We now have gravity. So instead of just a spray, we now have more of a fountain type of effect. So as you can see, particles are a great way to create effects. We have a number of major ways to create particles, such as particle flow, MASH, and the standard max particles. Now, particles can be affected by space warps, including forces such as gravity.